planar materials. Obviously, there's many planar materials, right? We have limited time, so I'm going to focus on two materials mostly. These were the materials that I asked for you to have today. If you wanted to follow along when I show some small demos, I'm going to be talking about the use of Bristol paper, right? So Bristol paper comes in many different thicknesses, right? We usually at Parsons use 2-ply, but if you don't have Bristol paper, any paper really will do. So that's totally fine. So that's just white paper. And also, once you're experimenting, it's actually really great to just use leftover paper, right? You don't necessarily always have to get a clean sheet, right? So that's totally fine. Corrugated cardboard, right? So another fantastic material that can be kind of reused and recycled, right? So don't throw away any of your, delivery boxes, right? Those are great things that we can use for model making. And then metal ruler, right, which we will use to be able to cut and score these materials, right? So you'll see that here. I'm going to show the difference between these two. You've probably already started working with them, but this one right here is the X-Acto knife, right? And this one is the Alpha knife, which is actually, Alpha is a brand. It's incorrect kind of to call it Alpha knife, but we all do. It's basically a box cutter. And a cutting mat. So that's just to protect your surface, right, that you cut different materials. So I recommended these two resources. They're just really kind of fun explorations into paper folding in particular. So I'm going to show actually some samples from this book, which you have access to, by the way, through the library, right? So you could actually access the digital copy of this book. It's fantastic, and actually I have it right here. I'm going to be showing you some examples, so I'll get to that later. And then a really brilliant documentary called Between the Folds. It just engages different people who are working in the realm of paper folding, extremely varied, from mathematicians to a business person to an artist, truly fantastic. So those are just resources that I wanted to share. That are just a fun thing to get into. So these are the two materials, and these are the two techniques that we will be mostly focusing on, right? So this idea of paper fold, and I'll get into that a little bit. These are both student projects. And with corrugated cardboard, there are obviously thousands of things one could do with corrugated cardboard. One technique that we use quite a bit is this idea of contouring and lamination. So basically you can actually cut different forms to create a complex form, as in this case is the bust of the student, right? So here, these are the two, right? So the paper fold and contouring or lamination. Again, do feel free to interrupt me, call out if you have any question, if I'm going too quickly or anything of that kind, yes? All right, so let's get to it. So paper folding, right? So there are, I would say, these are three big areas in which one could delve to start just getting our hands wet with paper folding, right? So this idea of a field of folds, right? So a fold is literally just something that we do to the paper to change its flatness, right? It becomes three-dimensional by something called scoring, which I will show you in a minute. And it's basically you're not taking any material out, you're not really cutting into it, you're just folding. So you're keeping sort of the integrity of the piece of paper you start with, but through scoring and very particular kind of actions that we have to do on the paper, we are able to really transform it, right? And I'll show you some fun examples of that in a minute, right? So a field of folds. A field of strips also is a kind of great way to start kind of, I guess, messing around with the integrity of the paper, right? Where we're literally just cutting strips and then seeing how the paper begins to move, right? Because there's this idea of the designing through making, right? So once you're able to have something that moves, you can actually kind of begin to just explore through the process of making. So this is a great technique. It does make the paper less sturdy, right? Because it becomes like mobile, but it's a helpful technique. And then a field of folds, which then, basically it's a field of a field of cells, a field of cells of different or similar shapes initially, that then you do different things to. So in this case, the student was actually exploring different folding and patterning on each of those cells. So just like big picture, right? Like these three kind of ways of beginning to explore paper. One of the key things to just have really clear from the very beginning is the idea of the mountain fold and the valley fold, right? So as you can see here, and I'll just go ahead and get the sample. Where is it? Sorry, it's behind here. So you can see it better on the image, but basically in order for the paper to begin to fold, you will have to consider a fold from in one direction and the other, right? So when I take a simple piece of paper and just fold it, right? So you can see me, right? You can see my screen. So if I just fold it this way and I'm looking this way, it's a mountain fold, right? Mountain meaning it just looks like a mountain, right? If I were to turn it, now it's a valley fold. And that's important because we always have to kind of beware of where we score, and I'll go through scoring, but scoring is basically a very light cut on this very top surface of a paper in order for us to create a very strong, tight crease. So if we want a mountain fold, right, I would have to score on the piece that I am looking at, right, and then it folds this way. If I want a valley fold, I have to score in the other direction. Does that make sense? So I'll show you more of that, but basically you have to turn the paper and score it. So I'm going to demo that, but I just want those two terms to be kind of clear, right? Mountain fold looks like a mountain, right? You score on the top. The valley fold looks like a valley. For it to fold that way, you have to score on the other side. And with the combination of these two, we can actually begin to create really complex and interesting folds. So these are some examples of kind of some cells, right? So you'll notice at the top, we have drawings, right, or line work that actually is a pattern, right, is a 2D pattern that we can draw on the piece of paper in order to then score and fold it to create these three-dimensional pieces. You'll see, of course, quite complex in some parts, right? We're not necessarily going to get into this level of complexity, but with very simple folds and cuts, you can actually create quite a bit of complexity and interesting pieces. So just to show you some other examples, these are student explorations, right? So strips, right? Cutting simple strips. One way is cutting them, but then not taking them out of the paper. So for instance, like this piece, right? And again, I have some examples I'm going to show you. Or just cutting strips of paper and then trying to weave them together, right? So here the students were exploring that. And again, in the weaving, you can then sort of manipulate each strip independently to create kind of almost like a fabric, right? You can almost create a fabric with this technique of strips, right, through weaving. But the first thing that I'll, definitely encourage you is just to have a go at it, right? Test it out, play around, cut a bunch of pieces of paper, just explore and see what happens, right? Nobody's kind of born knowing how to do this. You'll only kind of figure it out once you make. So one thing to try is just thinking about the kind of actions. Oh, I'm missing a T there, but the actions that one does on the paper. So I've already mentioned scoring. Scoring is taking the knife, X-Acto or Alpha knife, and very lightly, it's almost as if you're going to cut the paper, but you don't. It takes a while to get familiar with scoring, right? Sometimes one presses too hard and you actually cut the paper, or you don't press hard enough and it doesn't fold well. So it just takes practice. And depending on the material that you use, so Bristol paper scores fairly easily. If we use corrugated cardboard, we'd have to press a little bit harder, right? So we just also have to know the paper you use. So scoring, folding, of course, right? Enabled by the scoring. And then cutting, creasing, pleating. These are also terms that are used, in other disciplines, right? But these are things that the paper can do really nicely. So I just wanted to kind of put this image to show you. You can start super simple, right? Just a field of little squares, right? And even with that kind of very, very simple grid beginning, you can actually create quite a bit of complexity. So you see here the students are just basically taking that idea of the grid and just pushing and pulling the paper to see what happens, right? And how it transforms. We can then get into more complex patterns, right? So again, students exploring, excuse me, different ways of actually cutting through. But if you'll notice, if you look closely here, nothing is actually taken out. So there's a cut and there's a push of the piece of paper to create this very intricate, almost lace-like piece. And again, I'll be showing you some examples. But it takes time, of course, right? And one of the key things you'll notice in some of these tests is, of course, we want to draw a pattern initially first. We want to have something that's set up so that it makes kind of the actions that we're doing on the paper a little bit more directed. So you'll notice that in quite a few of these examples, certainly in this one, right? And it's totally fine, I would say, to see the line work, right? It's just the process of making the construction of this. And then we can become more elaborate, right? So these are, of course, much more elaborate. Here, students are actually exploring how those cells change, right? Slightly to create a kind of gradient effect. It's almost like an Escher-esque effect, right? If you're familiar with the work of M.C. Escher, who did these incredible, metamorphosizing images. So that's actually inspired by that. So we can get more complex with also the way we fold, whether we fold up or we fold down, and so on. Some more examples, of course, a little bit more complex. This was a fabulous piece which almost felt like it was alive when the student created it. It really moved as if it was this kind of live entity. And it's actually a very simple set of strips of paper that are kind of notched and put together. So just want to show you the versatility of this material, right? It's fairly inexpensive and you can do so much with it. As always, I would say start simple and also use, you can use the reference that I gave you that has very simple and complex patterns, right? So this pattern is actually one of those from the book. And then from that simple pattern, you can then explore different ways of pushing and pulling the paper to create different things, right? So you're ultimately the designer. You want to make patterns that are your own and unique. But it is helpful to start with something that is kind of structured. I want to show you some of those examples. With paper, there are things you can do, of course, when you take material out. You can begin suggesting and playing with light and also color, but the way that light shines through, right, to create different effects. So I know that some of you might be working on light fixtures, for example, or light elements. This is a great way to prototype different effects. So you'll see this is the pattern that the student was exploring, cutting that on the paper and then seeing how the paper almost naturally folds in different directions given the sort of pattern, right? As soon as you take material out of the paper, you are kind of weakening it a little bit, but that weakening might actually help when you want to start curving it and doing different things to it, as in this example, for example. In space materiality, in my section, we do quite a few of these explorations at the beginning, where we're actually creating almost like these second skins for our hands and arm. So you'll see how this is it's a fairly complex pattern, right? It's a complex pattern that gets repeated and it's sewn together. So these are small cells that are created and then sewn together to create this piece that actually moves. So the great thing about Bristol paper too, and again, I'll also show you some examples, is that it sews really, really well, right? You can sew it, you can also staple it, you can use wire. So it's a really versatile material. Some more examples, just want to show you kind of what you can create with them. These are sewn together. These are using a mixture of wire and paper. Some use like the same pattern that repeats and just gets smaller, and others use different patterns, right, depending on the part of the hands. But you could apply this to any of your projects, right? So if you're doing something that maybe a light fixture or a little enclosure, or certainly once you start kind of manipulating. So just to show you, this was actually using some jump rings, some other techniques, and so on. I'm going to be showing you these live, right, in a minute. But just initially, I want to tie in the use of the Bristol paper with the use of the cardboard. You'll notice, of course, that this is a hand sketch of a hand, right? And it's actually trying to show motion. So one of the things that we do with the Bristol paper is then we actually put it on an armature, which in the past we would make out of wood. We are currently going to be using corrugated cardboard, right? So corrugated cardboard is a really sturdy material, so it's a great material that can, substitute some projects that might have been made with wood. So you'll see here how the drawing gives rise to this. And the amazing thing, of course, is that wood is a planar material too. Cardboard is a planar material, right? It's flat. But by kind of using drawing techniques and having kind of a picture of what we want to do in 3D, we could, through lamination, which is basically, or contouring, which is basically cutting these different profiles and putting them together, we can create a fairly, robust and complex element, as in this case is the hand and arm. The other fantastic thing about corrugated cardboard, of course, is that if you take one layer off, it can actually start curving. So then it gives you even more possibilities for producing some of your designs. Right, so this is basically the look of corrugated cardboard when you tear it, right? So it's called corrugated because literally it has that corrugation. This is a little piece, right? And basically if you rip one of the layers off, it starts curving, right? It's less sturdy, but it is more versatile in terms of its form. This technique or these ways of working have been used quite a bit. This is a series of furniture pieces by Frank Gehry. These are basically really, really sturdy. You can sit on them. They last quite a while, and it's just cardboard that's been kind of, cut into these shapes and then laminated or kind of glued or connected together to create these forms. So different designs there. This is a project we often do at Parsons, which is actually students 3D scan their bust, right? And from that 3D scan, we are able to create these profiles, right? So you see the kind of profiles, which are basically cuts, right? It's as if we imagine we're kind of slicing our bust, right? And again, using planar materials, corrugated cardboard, as you can see here, we cut out each of those slices or each of those contours, and then recombine it together to create, a version of your own bust, right? So again, a great technique to create really anything, right? Just by having this idea of lamination and contours that can come together. Usually we don't encourage the use of glue, and some, faculty just don't allow it at all. So there are, of course, many alternatives to that. And here you see the student was actually using dowels, right? So just these rods that were kind of cutting across the different profiles. And it was quite great because she was able to separate the pieces to kind of fine tune to make it look closer to her own profile. Right, so you see here with even the hair, right? So she had to add a dowel there to connect the different parts. So that's also a great technique, is to use something else that can help create separation between those contours to create that volume.